Cedar Hollow, northern Iowa, November 1886. The first hard frost had turned the grass white, and the old lime kiln above the creek looked less like a building than a buried ruin. It stood in a circle of sumac and dead weeds, a round tower of limestone blocks with a black mouth where wagons had once hauled fuel and stone. The kiln had not burned lime in 20 years. Its iron doors were gone. Its upper rim had cracked. Rainwater ran down the inside wall in dark streaks. And inside that dead kiln, a man was smoothing fresh plaster over the stone. His name was Rory MacIver. He was 39, narrow-shouldered, red-bearded, and almost silent when he worked. He had a mason's hands, blunt at the fingertips, white with lime dust, and quick with a trowel. He was not sealing the kiln for livestock. He was not turning it into a storehouse. He was moving his family into it. The neighbors came up the hill in pairs to watch him. They saw the ribs of a wooden floor rising inside the circle. They saw a small iron pipe waiting at the center, where any sensible man would have built a chimney into the wall. They saw barrels of hydraulic lime that had cost more than most men would spend on a roof. By the third week, the township assessor, Jasper Mott, rode out to make the conversation official. Mott was a carpenter's son and a county man now. He trusted right angles. He trusted ledger lines. He trusted walls that could be measured, framed, taxed, and understood. He stood in the doorway of the kiln with his coat collar turned up, watching Rory press plaster into a seam between two massive blocks. "MacIver," he said, "you are not building a house. You are polishing a drain." Rory did not answer. Mott stepped inside and stamped his boot on the damp earth. "Come February, this place will sweat like a cellar. The wall will drink water out of the hill. The cold will sit in these stones all winter. You will have a round tomb with a stovepipe." Rory dragged the trowel upward, slow and clean. "The wall will not drink," he said. Mott laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Stone is cold. Everyone knows that." Rory looked at the great circular wall around them. "No," he said. "Stone is patient." That was the sentence Cedar Hollow repeated all winter. Stone is patient. It became a joke at the store, at the blacksmith's shed, at the church steps. Men who had never laid a foundation in their lives shook their heads over Rory MacIver's roundhouse. They called it the Kiln coffin. They said his wife Ruth would be carrying the children back to town before Christmas. But Rory had spent half his life around hot stone. In Scotland, before he crossed the ocean, he had worked lime kilns, malt houses, canal locks, and mill foundations. He knew stone differently than the men of Cedar Hollow knew it. They knew stone as something that sat in a field and froze your hand. Rory knew stone as something that could be trained by time. He knew a wall that had held a summer's sun could give back a trace of it after sunset. He knew a kiln face could stay warm long after the firebox went dark. He knew lime mortar, if mixed properly, did not merely cover a wall. It changed how the wall met water. Most of all, he knew the miserable truth about the houses everyone else was proud of. The MacIvers had spent their first winter in Iowa in a square-frame cabin at the bottom of the hill. It was built like every urgent frontier house: thin boards, paper gaps, a stove at one end, hope at the other. The cabin could get hot, that was not the problem. It could get so hot beside the stove that Ruth opened her collar and the children's cheeks went red. But 6 steps away, water crusted with ice. At night, the stove would burn down. By morning, the bedding felt damp. Frost feathered the nail heads. The floorboards held a gray cold that climbed through the feet and settled behind the ribs. Rory learned that winter that a house could be full of fire and still be losing. The neighbors blamed the weather. Rory blamed the walls. A frame cabin was quick to heat because there was almost nothing in it for the heat to enter. The air warmed, the stove glowed, and the comfort seemed real. But air is a poor savings account. The moment the fire dropped, the warmth ran toward the cracks, the glass, the roof, the corners. Those corners were the worst. Every square room made 4 little traps where cold air gathered and sat. Damp hid there. Mold began there. Children dragged stools away from those places without knowing why. The house was not a shelter storing warmth. It was a sieve wearing a roof. The people of Cedar Hollow answered that failure with labor. They cut more oak, split more oak, hauled more oak. A family could burn a cord in a brutal stretch and still wake up with frost inside the windows. They were not heating their homes. They were paying a fire to rent a few hours of air. Rory did not want another rented hour. He wanted a house that could keep what it was given. So he climbed the hill to the abandoned lime kiln. The kiln was ugly, but its ugliness was useful. Its wall was nearly 3.5 feet thick at the base. The limestone blocks had been laid in a near-perfect circle. The mass of the old stack was enormous. Not hundreds of pounds, but many tons. Other men saw ruin. Rory saw a bank. He began with water. For 2 weeks, he dug a shallow trench around the uphill side and lined it with broken stone, so rain would run around the kiln instead of under it. Then he scraped the interior clean. Soot, bird nests, damp leaves, loose mortar, all of it. Ruth and the children carried buckets while Rory worked the chisel into each failing joint. Then came the lime. He mixed hydraulic lime with sharp sand until it sat on the trowel like heavy cream. Ordinary lime plaster needed air to cure, and mud daub simply cracked and gave up. This lime was different. It set in the presence of moisture. It became a mineral skin. Rory pressed it into the joints, then spread it over the inside face of the kiln in a continuous pale layer. Not thick enough to hide the stone's strength, thick enough to stop the wall from drinking. Day after day, the scrape of his trowel echoed around the circle. Scrape, press, smooth. Scrape, press, smooth. The sound was so steady that Ruth said she could tell the hour by it. Then Rory did the thing that made the neighbors certain he had lost his senses. He built the fire in the middle. Not against the wall, not inside a big open fireplace. In the middle. A broad stone hearth sat at the center of the kiln floor, made from flat slabs he dragged from the creek bed. Above it, he hung a small iron pipe straight through the new roof. No brick chimney to swallow heat. No open throat to pull warm air out like a thief. Just a hard little draft path above a controlled fire. Around that hearth, but never touching the stone shell, Rory raised a small timber house inside the kiln. The posts stood away from the plastered wall, leaving a continuous airspace around the living room and sleeping loft. The wooden rooms were not trying to be the defense. They were the human nest. The stone was the workhorse. When the roof went on and the first smoke rose from the pipe, Jasper Mott returned with 2 farmers and the blacksmith, all of them ready to witness the final foolishness. The place looked stranger finished than it had unfinished. A tidy wooden door sat deep inside the old firing arch. A small window cut through the wall like the eye of a fortress. Inside, the curved lime plaster caught the firelight and returned it softly, without corners, without shadows piling up. Mott touched the wall with his knuckles. "Cold," he said. "For now," Rory answered. The blacksmith pointed at the little central fire. "That won't heat this whole stack." "No," Rory said. "Not at once." Mott took that for a confession. "There it is. You have built a house that admits its own failure." Rory looked at the embers, then at the wall. "I did not build it for at once." The first real test came in January, when the sky lowered and would not lift. It began as fog, not snow, not wind, just fog, dense, gray, and mean. Then the temperature fell through it. Every twig grew a white crust. Fence wire became a glass rope. The creek edges locked. Horses came from the fields with ice on their lashes. By the second morning, the thermometer outside the store read 31 below zero, and no one argued with it, because every hinge, pump handle, and breath agreed. Cedar Hollow shrank to stove circles. In the Reed's cabin, the children slept in caps. Their mother kept a kettle simmering all day just to push moisture into air that still bit the lungs. The walls groaned at night. Needles of frost appeared around nail heads. A bowl left on the table froze in a ring before dawn. At the Halverson place, the father carried wood until his hands shook too badly to stack it. The stove stayed red, but the corners stayed blue. They hung blankets across the room to make a smaller room, and then lived inside that square of cloth, as if their own house had become too large to defend. Down in the valley, men cursed the cold and fed at trees. Up on the hill, the dead kiln began to do what Rory had built it to do. Each morning, before the children were fully awake, Rory made a strong fire on the center hearth. For several hours, flame and coal threw heat outward in every direction. The air warmed first. Then the pale curved wall began to accept it. The warmth did not race through the limestone. It entered slowly, almost stubbornly, inch by inch. A thin wall lets heat pass. A massive wall makes heat wait. By noon, the inside face of the kiln had lost its stone-cold bite. By evening, after the second firing, the first depth of the wall was warm enough that Ruth could stand close to it and feel a quiet radiation on her skirt. When Rory banked the coals for the night, the fire stopped being the main heater. The wall took over. That was the part the village had not imagined. The fire did not need to battle the night minute by minute. It had already done its work earlier, storing heat in the mass around the room. Through the dark hours, the limestone released that heat back inward, gently and continuously, as if the kiln had developed a pulse. The shape mattered as much as the mass. In a square room, warmth finds corners and loses its courage. Air slows there. Damp settles there. Surfaces meet and leak in complicated ways. But Rory's room had no corners. The hearth could see the whole wall. The wall could see itself across the circle. Radiant heat moved cleanly through the space. There were no dead pockets where the cold could crouch. Ruth noticed it before anyone else believed it. She noticed that the lamp flame no longer flickered from drafts. She noticed that the children stopped pulling their chairs toward the stove. She noticed that her bread sponge, left in a crock on a shelf far from the fire, kept rising through the night. That crock became the impossible object in the MacIver house. Everywhere else in Cedar Hollow, yeast had gone sluggish or dead. Dough sat like a lump unless it was kept beside the stove and guarded like a sick child. In Rory's kiln house, Ruth's sponge bubbled gently by morning, alive under a linen cloth. Not because the room was hot. It was not hot. It was steady. The thermometer Rory hung beside the shelf never fell below 64 degrees during the coldest part of that week. On the 5th day of the freeze, Jasper Mott came up the hill again. He did not come to apologize. Not yet. Now he came because the county road curved below the kiln, and his mare had thrown a shoe on the ice. He led her by the bridle, hunched against the frozen fog, muttering at the cruelty of January and the stupidity of animals. When the mare slipped near the firing arch, Mott grabbed for the only solid thing near him. His bare hand hit the outer wall. He expected pain. A man knows the cold of stone in winter. He expects a dead shock, a flash that bites through skin and settles in the bones. But Mott's hand did not recoil. It stayed there. The stone was not warm like a stove. It was not even warm like a living body. It was something stranger. It was warmer than the air by a measure his hand could not deny. A deep buried warmth seemed to come from inside the wall, not from the surface. Mott stood frozen for a reason that had nothing to do with weather. He pulled off his glove and pressed his palm flat. The world around him was 30 below. The wall had warmth in it. For the first time, Jasper Mott understood that Rory MacIver had not been trying to keep cold out by force. He had been storing fire where the cold could not steal it quickly. Mott tied the mare to a post and knocked. When Ruth opened the door, the warmth that moved out was not the blast of a stove room. It did not smell scorched. It did not carry smoke. It was calm, dry, and even. Mott stepped inside and saw Thomas carving a scrap of wood on the floor in his shirt sleeves. He saw Nell asleep on a bench without a cap. He saw Ruth kneading dough at a table 12 feet from the coals. And he saw the crock on the shelf. Ruth lifted the linen cloth. The sponge underneath was alive with tiny bubbles. Mott stared at it as if she had shown him a bird singing underwater. "How?" he said. Rory did not give him a lecture. He took the poker and turned a coal on the hearth. "The fire warms the wall," he said. "The wall warms the night." Mott looked around the circle. He saw the pale lime skin, the air gap, the central hearth, the thickness of the old kiln. All of the absurd choices arranged themselves into one clean idea. He had mistaken slowness for failure. A week later, after the fog lifted and the road opened, Mott came back with a notebook instead of a warning. He measured the wall thickness. He counted the hours of firing. He compared Rory's woodpile with the reeds. He wrote down the shelf temperature at dawn, then again after sundown. He asked Ruth about damp. She told him there was none, not in the bedding, not behind the shelves, not under the floor. By March, the numbers were too plain to laugh at. The reeds had nearly emptied their second woodstack. The Halversons had borrowed split oak from a cousin. Rory MacIver still had more than half of his winter pile under cover. His family had burned less than a third of what the valley expected a house to swallow. But the fuel was only the part that men liked to measure. The real difference was the absence of panic. There was no 3 a.m. scramble to save a dying fire, no morning ice on the washwater, no children waking hoarse from breathing cold, damp air, no frantic shrinking of life toward the stove. The kiln house did not create summer. It created steadiness, and in a northern winter, steadiness was a kind of mercy. The story spread because it sounded impossible, and then survived inspection. That spring, a farm journal printed a short article about the round kiln house near Cedar Hollow. The writer called it a practical experiment in stored heat. He described the hydraulic lime, the separated timber frame, the central hearth, and the heavy circular wall. He did not call it magic. He called it delayed release. That phrase did more for Rory than praise ever could. Delayed release meant the idea could travel. It meant the house was not a miracle belonging to one stubborn Scotsman. It was a principle. A barn wall could do it. A stone smokehouse could do it. A cellar, built dry and heavy, could do part of it. Any structure with mass, dryness, and controlled heat could stop acting like a bucket with a hole in it and start acting like a reservoir. Within 2 years, 3 families in the county had altered old stone outbuildings using Rory's pattern. None copied it exactly. One used a square dairy house and had to fight the corners with interior partitions. One used a spring house and learned the hard way that water management mattered first. One rebuilt a collapsed smokehouse wall and made a tiny winter room for an elderly mother who had not slept warm in a decade. The lesson was not that everyone should live in a kiln. The lesson was sharper than that. A wall is not just a boundary. It can be a machine. Most of Cedar Hollow had built as if warmth were a thing to trap in air. Rory built as if warmth were a thing to deposit, hold, and withdraw. The others made rooms that demanded constant payment. He made a room that could save. Years later, when new stoves arrived and coal wagons changed the arithmetic of winter, people still pointed to the old round house on the hill. Some saw it as a curiosity. Some saw it as proof that old country stubbornness could shame a whole township. Jasper Mott saw it more clearly than most. He had been the man with the ledger, the man who knew what a proper house should look like. He had mocked the circle because it did not fit the measurements he trusted. Then, on a morning cold enough to stop a pump handle solid, he had placed his hand on a wall that remembered yesterday's fire. That was the moment the old certainty cracked. Rory MacIver had not defeated winter by overpowering it. He had not built thicker simply because thicker sounded stronger. He had matched the speed of the problem. Cold moves through a massive wall slowly, so he made heat move slowly too. He stopped fighting with bursts and began working with delay. That is why the roundhouse mattered. Every square cabin in Cedar Hollow drew a line and spent all winter defending it. Inside against outside, fire against cold, man against weather. The line leaked, and the people paid for the leak in wood, sleep, and strength. Rory built a circle, no corners for the chill to own, no thin wall for warmth to sprint through, no fireplace mouth stealing the room's breath. Just stone, lime, air, and fire, arranged so time could become part of the shelter. The villagers thought he had moved his family into a dead kiln. What he had really built was a memory for heat.